In the silence where grief echoes longest, Elliot Kane's calloused hands still reach for ghosts. 7 years since rain fell on 2 graves, leaving his heart as barren as Dust Valley itself. His eyes no longer meet those of strangers, until a child's desperate cry slices through his solitude like summer lightning. My mother is wounded. Sometimes healing comes through helping others heal, through small hands seeking yours in darkness, through eyes that see your pain and stay anyway. If this journey of loss and unexpected second chances touches your heart, let your like be a whisper that says, I too have known both sorrow and hope. And tell us, how do you think Elliot's story ends? Comment below. Your life wisdom adds another chapter to our shared human story. The sun broke over Dust Valley like a yolk spilling across the sky, painting the barren plains in hues of amber and gold. In this land where silence reigned supreme, even the wind seemed to hold its breath at dawn. Elliot. Kane sat motionless atop his dun horse, a silhouette carved against the horizon, as still as the mountains that framed the distance. His weathered hat cast a shadow over eyes that rarely met those of others, eyes that had grown accustomed to seeing nothing but dust, sky, and the occasional wandering coyote. The valley stretched before him, a vast emptiness that matched the hollow within his chest. 7 years he'd ridden these trails, 7 years since he'd last heard a voice that wasn't his own, whispered into the ear of his horse or muttered into a cup of bitter coffee. 7 years of carrying a wooden pendant in his pocket, worn smooth from countless times his thumb had traced its curves, a ritual that anchored him to a past he both cherished and fled from. Elliot urged his horse forward along the narrow trail that wound between the abandoned Wilcox Ranch and the ravine locals called Devil's Spine. The morning air carried the scent of sage and earth, familiar companions on his solitary rides. Then came the sound, sharp and desperate, that sliced through the stillness like lightning through a summer sky. My mother is wounded. The voice belonged to a child, high and frightened. Elliot reined his horse to a stop, its hooves kicking up clouds of russet dust. For a moment he hesitated. 7 years of isolation had taught him that involvement meant pain, that connection led only to loss. But some instincts run deeper than fear. He turned toward the sound and saw her, a small girl, no more than 8 years old, standing in the middle of the trail. Her hair hung in wild tangles around a dirt-smudged face, and her eyes, wide and brown, brimmed with tears and terror. Her bare feet were cracked and dusty, her simple dress torn at the hem. "Mister," she gasped, chest heaving with exertion. "Please help. My mama's bleeding bad." Elliot swung down from his saddle, boots landing heavily in the dirt. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work and wandering, hung awkwardly at his sides. The girl stared up at him, her gaze both pleading and wary. "Where?" The word felt strange in his mouth, unused to speaking. The girl pointed toward a cluster of cottonwoods that marked the beginning of the ravine. Without waiting for a response, she turned and began running, glancing back only to ensure he followed. Elliot led his horse after her, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sensation he'd thought long buried beneath the weight of solitude. The girl led him to a hidden clearing, a pocket of green amid the arid landscape where a spring bubbled from between stones. Among scattered belongings, a small bundle of clothes, a dented cooking pot, a worn leather book, lay a woman. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage wrapped around her upper arm, a bright crimson against the faded blue of her sleeve. Her face, though pale with pain, held a quiet dignity that struck Elliot with unexpected force. Dark hair, framed features that spoke of hardship endured with grace. "She fell," the girl explained, her voice small. "We was climbing down to the water and the rocks gave way. Her arm got cut real bad on the sharp ones below." Elliot knelt beside the woman, his movements careful, measured. He reached for her wrist, felt the flutter of pulse beneath his fingertips. Her skin was warm with fever. At his touch, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze, disoriented at first, slowly focused on his face. Eyes, the color of rain-washed sage, met his, eyes that had seen sorrow and survived it. For a moment neither spoke, each recognizing in the other something familiar, something understood without words. "Clara," the woman whispered, looking past him to the girl. "You found help." The girl, Clara, nodded fiercely. pride momentarily overcoming fear. "I ran just like you said, Mama. Found this mister on the trail." Without speaking, Elliot removed his bandana and tore a strip from his own shirt. With practiced movements that betrayed some knowledge of tending wounds, he began to clean and rebind the woman's arm. The cut was deep but clean, slicing through flesh, but missing anything vital. "Name's Isabel," the woman said, wincing as he worked. Her voice had a musical quality, despite the pain that threaded through it. "Isabel Mercer, this is my daughter Clara." Elliot nodded, focusing on his task. Names meant connections. Connections meant complications. Yet something compelled him to offer his own in return. Elliot Kane. 3 syllables that hadn't passed his lips in years. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," Isabel replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "Seems we're in your debt." He shook his head slightly. "Needs stitching," he said, nodding toward her arm. "And proper cleaning. Got supplies at my place." He paused, the invitation unfamiliar territory. "Can you ride?" "If it means not bleeding to death in this ravine, I surely can," she answered, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. Despite the pain, with gentle but efficient movements, Elliot helped Isabel to her feet. Clara hurriedly gathered their meager belongings, clutching the leather book to her chest with particular care. Elliot lifted Isabel onto his horse, then hoisted Clara up to sit before him in the saddle. With one arm around the child to keep her secure, and the other holding the reins, he began the journey to his ranch, nestled in the foothills that bordered the western edge of Dust Valley. As they rode, Elliot couldn't help but notice how the weight of another person against his chest, even one as small as Clara, felt at once foreign and forgotten, like a language once known, but long unused. The child sat rigid at first, then gradually relaxed against him, her small hand eventually coming to rest on his forearm. Behind them, Isabel swayed slightly with the horse's movement, her breathing steady but labored. Once, when he glanced back to check on her, he found her watching him, her gaze thoughtful. "Not much farther," he said, the words feeling rough in his throat. She nodded, and in that simple acknowledgement lay a trust that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Elliot's ranch sat like a secret in the fold of 2 hills, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral beside it. A windmill creaked slowly in the breeze, drawing water from deep beneath the earth. The structure wasn't grand. Weathered logs stacked and sealed against the elements, a stone chimney rising from a pitched roof, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, but it stood solid against the backdrop of wild country, a testament to stubborn endurance. As they approached, Clara's eyes widened. "You live here all alone, mister?" Elliot nodded, helping Isabel down from the horse. Her knees buckled slightly as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her weight against him. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wildflowers in her hair, a startling softness in this harsh land. "Steady now," he murmured, guiding her toward the cabin. Inside, the space was spare but not barren. A table and chairs sat near a cast-iron stove. Shelves held provisions and a few books, their spines cracked from repeated reading. A rocking chair faced the hearth, and beside it stood a wooden chest, its lid closed, a layer of dust suggesting it remained untouched for years. The single room was clean and ordered, everything in its place, the dwelling of a man who preferred simplicity to comfort, function to sentiment. Yet there were anomalies, a small carved horse on the mantel, its details lovingly rendered, a faded quilt folded over the back of the rocking chair, its pattern speaking of hands that had crafted it with care. Elliot helped Isabel to the bed tucked against the far wall, then moved with purpose to a cabinet where he kept medical supplies. Clara hovered near her mother, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space, taking in every detail. "Waters." "Fresh," Elliot said, nodding toward a bucket and dipper on a small stand. "Help yourself." While Clara eagerly drank, Elliot set to work properly cleaning and stitching Isabel's wound. His fingers moved with surprising gentleness for hands so large and work roughened. Isabel watched him, her breath catching only slightly at the bite of the needle. "You've done this before," she observed. He nodded once. "War teaches things. Not all useful after, but some." "Which one?" she asked. "The one that should have ended all others." A pause. "Didn't." Isabel studied his face. No, I don't suppose it did. As he worked, Clara explored the cabin with the natural curiosity of childhood, pausing before the carved horse on the mantel. Did you make this? She asked, pointing. Elliot glanced up briefly. Long time ago. It looks just like a real horse, she said with admiration. Could you teach me to make one? The question hung in the air, laden with assumptions of time and connection that Elliot wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Instead of answering, he finished the last stitch on Isabel's arm and began wrapping clean bandages around it. You'll need rest, he told Isabel. Few days at least. We've imposed enough, she replied, though her pale face and the slight tremor in her hands belied her ability to travel. Once I can stand properly— Stay, Elliot interrupted, surprising himself as much as her. The words seemed to echo in the quiet room. Till you're healed. Safer. Here. Isabel's eyes met his, searching. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, for she nodded slowly. Thank you, she said simply. That night, Elliot slept on a bedroll near the hearth, having insisted Isabel and Clara take his bed. The unfamiliar sound of other breathing in his space kept him awake long after the lantern was extinguished, staring at the shadows that danced across the ceiling. At some point in the night, he heard the soft pad of bare feet and turned to see Clara, standing beside his makeshift bed, her small form silhouetted against the dying embers. Can't sleep, she whispered. Without a word, Elliot shifted, making space on his bedroll. The child hesitated only a moment before lying down beside him, her back against his chest. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Elliot remained awake, unaccustomed to the warm weight of another being so close, to the trust implicit in such vulnerability. His hand hovered uncertainly before coming to rest. Lightly on Clara's shoulder, a gesture of protection he had thought forgotten. In the pocket of his trousers, the wooden pendant pressed against his thigh, a reminder of another child, another life, another time when he had failed to protect what mattered most. Days at the ranch unfolded in a rhythm Elliot had nearly forgotten, the cadence of shared lives rather than solitary existence. Mornings began with the preparation of food, a task he now performed for 3 instead of 1. Clara shadowed him constantly, her initial shyness giving way to a stream of questions and observations that filled the spaces he had long left to silence. Why do you always wear that hat even inside sometimes? She asked as they collected eggs from the small coop behind the barn. Is your hair funny looking? A brief smile tugged at the corner of Elliot's mouth. Just habit. Mama says habits are hard to break once they set in, Clara replied, carefully placing an egg in her basket. Like how I always sleep, with my book under my pillow even though she says I'll crush it someday. Elliot glanced at her. Special book? Clara nodded seriously. It was my pa's. It's got all these drawings of plants and animals and what they're good for. Pa was studying to be a doctor before— She trailed off, then continued more quietly. Before he got sick and died last winter. The information settled between them, another piece of the puzzle that was Clara and Isabel Mercer. Elliot said nothing, but he slowed, his pace slightly to match the girl's smaller steps as they returned to the cabin. Inside, Isabel sat at the table, her injured arm cradled against her body, her good hand wrapped around a cup of coffee. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes were clear, the fever having broken during the second night. She looked up as they entered, her gaze lingering on Elliot with a warmth that made him suddenly conscious of his unshaven face and worn clothing. Successful hunting expedition? She asked with a smile. Clara proudly displayed her basket of eggs. Mr. Kane let me collect most of them all by myself, even from that mean brown hen that pecks. Mr. Kane seems to have hidden talents, Isabel observed, her eyes still on Elliot. Not every man knows how to approach a stubborn hen. Or a stubborn child, Elliot replied quietly, the closest he had come to humor since their arrival. Isabel's smile deepened, reaching her eyes in a way that transformed her face, revealing a beauty. That hardship had dimmed but not extinguished. Indeed, as days passed, Elliot found himself drawn into their lives in ways both subtle and profound. He showed Clara how to mend a fence, her small hands awkwardly wielding tools alongside his larger ones. He sat in companionable silence with Isabel on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the valley in fire and shadow. One such evening, as Clara slept inside, Isabel broke the quiet between them. "You've been alone out here a long time." It wasn't a question, but Elliot answered anyway. 7 years. By choice. He considered the wooden pendant in his pocket, his thumb finding its familiar contours. Seemed safer. Isabel studied him in the fading light. For you? Or for others? The question struck too close to truths he kept buried. Elliot stood, moving to the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Both. He felt, rather than saw her rise and move to stand beside him. Close, but not touching. "Whatever happened, Elliot, whatever you're carrying, it doesn't define all of who you are." The sound of his given name in her voice stirred something long dormant within him. He turned to face her, finding her eyes in the gathering dusk. "How can you know that?" The question emerged rough with emotion he'd thought excised years ago. "Because I've seen how you are with Clara," she replied simply. "How you look at her, when you think no one's watching, like she's something precious you're afraid to." "Break." She paused, her good hand lifting hesitantly before coming to rest lightly on his forearm. That's not the touch of a man who deserves to be alone. The contact, though slight, burned through the fabric of his shirt. Elliot stood motionless, caught between the instinct to pull away and the desperate hunger for connection that her touch awakened. "I should check the horses," he said finally, stepping back. Isabel let her hand fall, but her gaze held his a moment longer. "They'll still be there in the morning," she said softly. "Some things can wait, Elliot." But he turned and walked into the darkness, seeking the solitude of the barn, where the quiet nickers of horses demanded nothing he wasn't prepared to give. Clara discovered the wooden carvings on a rainy afternoon that kept them confined to the cabin. Restless with indoor captivity, she had taken to exploring every corner of Elliot's home, examining objects and asking questions that he answered with increasing patience. "What's in here?" she asked, pointing to the wooden chest beside the rocking chair, the one that gathered dust untouched. Elliot looked up from the bridle he was mending, his expression suddenly guarded. Nothing for playing with. Clara's face fell slightly, but she nodded and moved on to investigate the bookshelf instead. Later, however, when Elliot stepped outside to check that the rain wasn't flooding the chicken coop, the temptation proved too great. When he returned, he found her sitting, cross-legged on the floor, the chest open before her, several wooden figures arranged carefully on a cloth she had spread out. Isabel, seated nearby, looked up with an expression of apology and concern. "Clara," she began, but the girl interrupted. "They're beautiful," Clara breathed, holding up a carving of a girl about her age, the wooden figure caught in mid-step, laughing. "Did you make all these, Mr. Kane?" Elliot stood motionless in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat and coat. His eyes fixed on the open chest, on the carved figures. A family of 4, a dog, a house, scenes from a life now visible after years of careful burial. The silence stretched taut as wire. Clara, sensing the change in atmosphere, carefully placed the carving back on the cloth. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have opened it without asking." Elliot crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling before the chest. With hands that barely trembled, he gathered the carvings and returned them to their resting place, each placement deliberate, almost ritualistic. The last to be returned was the figure of the girl, which he held a moment longer than the others, his thumb tracing the curve of its wooden cheek. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally, his voice low. "My daughter." Clara's eyes widened. Isabel moved to the edge of her chair, her gaze never leaving Elliot's face. "She was 7 when the fever took her." The words emerged as if drawn from a deep well. "Her mother, my wife, Anna, followed 3 days later. Same fever." He closed the chest, his hand lingering on its lid. "I carved these while they were alive, one for each birthday, each Christmas. After, I couldn't stop making them, as if keeping their story going might bring them back somehow." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Foolishness." "It's not foolish," Isabel said quietly. "It's love." Elliot looked up, meeting her gaze. "Love doesn't preserve, doesn't protect." "No," she agreed. "But it remembers, it honors." She hesitated, then added, "It heals sometimes if we let it." Clara moved closer to Elliot, her small hand coming to rest on his sleeve. "I bet Sarah would think they're real nice, the carvings," she said, with the simple certainty of childhood. "My pa used to draw pictures for me. Mama saved them all in a special place." Something shifted in Elliot's expression, a softening, a yielding. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden pendant he always carried. Opening his palm, he revealed a small, intricately carved flower. "Wild rose," he explained. "Sarah's favorite. Found them growing on a hillside once, brought her a bunch. Never saw a child so delighted by a handful of flowers." The memory curved his lips upward. "Made this for her 6th birthday. She wore it on a ribbon around her neck." Clara studied the carving with reverence. "It looks so real, like it might smell sweet if you put your nose to it. Would you—" Elliot began, then stopped, the words difficult. "Would you like to hold it?" Clara nodded solemnly. With care bordering on ceremony, Elliot placed the pendant in her small palm. Clara examined it closely, turning it to catch the light from the window. "It's the prettiest thing I ever saw," she declared. "Yes," Elliot agreed, but his eyes had moved to Isabel, who watched them with tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Some things are. That night, for the first time, Elliot did not retrieve the pendant when Clara returned it. Instead, he showed her how to wrap it carefully in a handkerchief and place it on the mantel beside the carved horse. "Sometimes," he told her, as they stood looking at the two carvings, "things are safer in the open than locked away." Clara nodded, as if she understood perfectly. "Like secrets," she said. "Mama says secrets get heavier the longer you keep them." Elliot glanced toward Isabel, who sat by the fire, pretending absorption in her mending. "Your mama's a wise woman." "That's what Pa always said too," Clara replied, yawning widely. As Elliot tucked her into bed that night, a task that had somehow become his rather than Isabel's, Clara asked sleepily, "Will you make me a carving sometime, Mr. Kane? Maybe a wild rose like Sarah's?" The question caught him off guard, a reminder of how quickly this child had breached walls it had taken years to build. He should refuse, establish boundaries, maintain the distance that had kept him safe for so long. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll think on it," which both of them knew meant yes. Isabel's arm healed steadily, the angry red of the wound fading to pink, then to a thin white line that would eventually become just another scar among the collection life had given her. Her strength returned more fully each day, bringing with it the unspoken question of departure, a question Elliot found himself increasingly reluctant to answer. One morning, as they worked together in the small garden behind the cabin, Isabel broached the subject indirectly. "Clara's becoming quite attached to this place," she said, her hands gently weeding around young tomato plants. "And to you." Elliot continued his work, turning soil with a hoe. "Children adapt quickly." "Yes," Isabel agreed, "though sometimes too well. Makes the next uprooting that much harder." Elliot paused, leaning on his tool. "You've moved around a lot." "Since James, Clara's father, died, yes." Isabel sat back on her heels, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "We had a small homestead near Grayson Creek. After the funeral, I couldn't keep up with the work, and the bank was unsympathetic." Her voice held no self-pity, only the matter-of-factness of someone accustomed to hardship. "We've been traveling since, looking for somewhere to start over. I have skills, nursing, sewing, teaching letters. Just need to find a place willing to employ a woman with a child in tow." "Dust Valley's not much for prospects," Elliot said, resuming his hoeing. "Nearest real town's Cottonwood Springs, 20 miles east." "So I've heard." Isabel rose, dusting soil from her skirt. "Once I'm fully mended, we'll head that direction." Elliot nodded, keeping his eyes on his work. The thought of the cabin returning to its previous silence, no Clara's laughter, no Isabel's quiet presence, settled like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. "Unless," Isabel added softly, "there's reason to consider other options." Elliot looked up. Then, finding her eyes on him, a question in them he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Before he could respond, Clara came running around the corner of the cabin, her face alight with discovery. "Mama, Mr. Kane, look what I found in the barn loft." She held up a leather-bound book, its cover worn but well preserved. "It's got stories in it." Elliot recognized the volume immediately, a collection of folk tales and legends he'd once read aloud on winter evenings, In another life, to another child. He'd thought it lost years ago, or perhaps deliberately forgotten its existence. The collected tales of the American frontier, Isabel read from the spine. Oh, Clara, be careful with Mr. Kane's book. It's all right, Elliot said. Books are meant for reading, not gathering dust. Will you read some to me? Clara asked eagerly. There's one about a giant bear that looks scary. Elliot hesitated, memories surfacing of another voice begging for stories, another pair of eyes, wide with anticipation. Maybe your mother would... I think, Isabel interrupted gently, that Mr. Kane would tell it best. After all, it's his book. He'd know the parts worth emphasizing. Her eyes met his, understanding in their depths. Sometimes, revisiting old joys helps create new ones. That evening after supper, Elliot found himself seated in the rocking chair, the book open on his lap, Clara curled beside him on a stool, her eyes bright with expectation. Isabel sat nearby, her hands busy with mending, but her attention clearly on the scene before her. The legend of old Ephraim, Elliot began, his voice uncertain at first, then strengthening as he continued. The great grizzly of Echo Canyon. As he read, something long frozen within him began to thaw. The words flowed more easily, his voice finding the rhythms of storytelling remembered from years past. He added emphasis where the tale grew tense, softened when speaking of the bear's eventual fate. Clara gasped and clutched his arm at the exciting parts, her eyes never leaving his face. When the story concluded, she sighed with satisfaction. That was better than when Mama reads, she declared, then quickly amended. Though Mama does real good too. Isabel smiled. I'm sure Mr. Kane has had more practice with bear stories than I have. Could we read another tomorrow night? Clara asked Elliot, hope plain in her expression. The question hung between them, laden with implication. Tomorrow, and perhaps days. Beyond, stretching into a future neither of them had anticipated when their paths first crossed. If you help with the evening chores without complaint, Elliot replied, surprising himself with how easily the bargain came to his lips, a ghost of negotiations once made with another child. I will, Clara promised fervently. I'll even collect eggs from the mean hen. Later, after Clara had been tucked into bed, Isabel joined Elliot on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like salt across the vast darkness above the valley. You've done that before, she observed. Read to a child. Elliot nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. Sarah loved stories. Would have read all night if we'd let her. You were a good father, Elliot. The words struck him like physical blows. Not good enough. Isabel moved closer, her shoulder almost touching his where they leaned against the porch railing. The fever wasn't your fault. You know that. Should have gotten the doctor sooner. Should have recognized the signs. The old recriminations spilled out, well-worn from years of repetition. Was too busy with the spring planting, thought it was just a childish cold. And blaming yourself has helped how exactly? Isabel's voice held no judgment, only a gentle challenge. Has it brought them back? Made their memory clearer? Given you peace? Elliot turned to face her, startled by the directness of her question. Isabel met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away from the pain she saw there. They deserved better than what I gave them, he said finally. Perhaps, she agreed. And perhaps you deserve better than what you've given yourself these 7 years. She reached out slowly, her fingers coming to rest lightly on his hand where it gripped the railing. Punishment without end isn't justice, Elliot. It's just another kind of death. He looked down at her hand covering his, small but strong, marked with the evidence of hard work and harder living. Without conscious thought, he turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. They stood that way for a long time, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, speaking volumes in silence. The storm came without warning, rolling over the western hills like a dark tide, bringing with it wind that bent the cottonwoods along the creek, and rain that fell in sheets rather than drops. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Clara huddled by the hearth, her eyes wide with fear at each thunderclap. Isabel moved about the cabin, closing shutters and placing buckets beneath the 2 spots where the roof leaked. Elliot had just returned from securing the livestock in the barn. his clothing soaked through, water dripping from his hat onto the wooden floor. "Will the chickens be all right?" Clara asked anxiously as he hung his wet coat by the door. "They're tucked up safe," he assured her, running a hand through his damp hair. "Chickens have more sense than people sometimes." They headed for shelter at the first sign of trouble. Another crack of thunder shook the cabin, and Clara flinched, drawing her knees up to her chest. Elliot crossed to her, crouching down to her level. "It's just the sky clearing its throat," he said, repeating words he'd once used to comfort another frightened child. "Making room for better weather to come along." Clara looked unconvinced. "It sounds angry." "Sounds can deceive," Elliot replied. "Like that old rooster that crows so fierce but runs from a field mouse." A small smile touched Clara's lips. "He is a coward, isn't he?" "Biggest one in the valley," Elliot confirmed seriously. Isabel watched them from across the room, something soft and wondering in her expression. "Clara," she said after a moment, "why don't you fetch your book? Perhaps there's a story in there that might drown out the storm." As Clara hurried to retrieve her father's medical journal from beside the bed, Isabel moved closer to Elliot, speaking low. "You're good with her, natural." Elliot straightened, discomfort flickering across his features. "Just remembering what worked before." "And that's a gift," Isabel insisted, "using past knowledge to ease present fears." She paused, then added more quietly, "Something some of us still struggle with." Before Elliot could respond, Clara returned with her precious book, settling cross-legged on the rug before the fire. Elliot and Isabel joined her, forming a small circle in the warm glow of the hearth, while the storm raged outside. Clara opened the journal carefully, revealing pages filled with meticulous drawings of plants and handwritten notes about their properties. "Pa was learning which plants heal and which ones don't," she explained to Elliot. "He said nature provides medicine for every ailment, if you know where to look." "A wise man," Elliot observed, studying the detailed illustrations. "He was teaching me too, before—" Clara swallowed hard. "I remember some of it." "Show me," Elliot encouraged. Clara turned pages until she found a drawing of a familiar purple flower. "This one's echinacea. It helps with fevers and colds." She turned another page. "And this is willow bark. Pa said it eases pain almost like the medicine doctors use." As Clara continued her impromptu lesson, the storm's fury gradually diminished, though rain still fell steadily. The thunder became more distant, each rumble less threatening than the last. Absorbed in the book and the knowledge it contained, Clara forgot her fear. Later, after Clara had fallen asleep on her pallet near the hearth, Elliot and Isabel sat at the table, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The rain pattered softly against the roof, a gentle counterpoint to the occasional crackle from the fire. "She carries him with her that way," Isabel said, nodding toward the book that Clara had carefully returned to its place beneath her pillow. "Through what he taught her, what he believed in." "And you?" Elliot asked. "How do you carry him?" The question was more personal than any he had asked before, crossing a boundary he had carefully maintained. But the intimacy created by the storm, by the circle of light they had shared against the darkness, made it seem natural. Isabel considered her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "In memories, mostly. In trying to honor the path we planned together." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "But I'm not very good at ghosts, Elliot. Never have been. I believe in the living too much." "Even when the living disappoint?" "Especially then." A sad smile touched her lips. "The dead are perfect in memory. The living are flawed, complicated, real." Elliot studied her face in the firelight, the strength in her jaw, the kindness around her eyes, the determination in the set of her mouth. "You've lost as much as I have," he observed, "yet you haven't hidden yourself away." "Haven't I?" Isabel challenged gently. "Moving from place to place, never settling, always ready to leave before being asked to go, that's its own kind of hiding." The honesty of her admission created a space for his own. "I came here to disappear," Elliot said quietly. "After Anna and Sarah died, I couldn't bear the sympathy, the whispers, the well-meaning advice. Sold everything, rode until I found somewhere no one knew my name or my story. And did it help? Disappearing?" Elliot's gaze drifted to Clara's sleeping form, then back to Isabel. "For a time, until I realized I was disappearing from myself as well. And now?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Elliot reached across the table slowly, his hand coming to rest beside hers, not quite touching. "Now I'm remembering what it is to be seen," he said simply, "and finding it less frightening than I expected." Isabel turned her hand palm upward, an invitation rather than a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Elliot placed his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining with a rightness that neither was prepared to name. Outside, the storm continued its retreat, leaving in its wake a world washed clean, ready for renewal. The morning after the storm dawned clear and brilliant, the world scrubbed to a pristine brightness. Puddles reflected a sky of perfect blue, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and growing things. Clara insisted on accompanying Elliot to check for damage around the property, her energy boundless after being confined indoors by the previous day's weather. As they walked the perimeter of the small ranch, Clara's hand found its way naturally into Elliot's, a gesture that had become increasingly common between them. Her chatter filled the morning air, questions and observations tumbling over one another, in an endless stream that required little response beyond occasional nods or single-word answers. "Mr. Kane," she said suddenly, interrupting her own description of a robin's nest she had discovered in the cottonwood nearest the cabin. "Are you ever lonely out here all by yourself?" The question, delivered with a child's guileless directness, caught Elliot unprepared. He looked down at Clara, finding her eyes fixed on him with solemn curiosity. "Used to it," he replied after a moment. "That's not the same as not being lonely," Clara pointed out with unexpected perception. "Mama says you can get used to most anything, even things that aren't good for you." Elliot considered this. As they continued walking, "Your mama's right about that." "She usually is," Clara agreed seriously. "Except about how long it takes to bake biscuits. She always burns them a little." A smile tugged at Elliot's lips. Nobody's right about everything. They had reached the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. The storm had swelled it beyond its usual banks, turning the gentle stream into a rushing current that carried twigs and leaves in its hurried journey south. "Will you be sad when we leave?" Clara asked, watching the water's movement with fascination. The question landed like a stone in Elliot's chest. "Will you?" he countered, unwilling to expose his own feelings. Clara nodded vigorously. "I like it here. I like the chickens, even the mean one. I like how quiet it is at night, except for the crickets. I like—" She hesitated, then looked up at him with painful honesty. "I like how you don't talk to me like I'm a baby, and how you're teaching me things, and how you read stories." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I like having you around. It's nice, like having a pa again a little bit." Something within Elliot shifted, a wall crumbling that had stood firm for 7 years. He crouched down to Clara's level, his hands coming to rest lightly on her shoulders. "I like having you around too," he said quietly. "Both of you." Clara's face brightened. "Then why do we have to leave? Couldn't we stay here? Mama can cook, well, mostly, and sew real good. And I can help with the chickens and learn more about the horses." The hope in her expression was almost unbearable. Elliot chose his words carefully. "That would be up to your mama, Clara, and she might have plans that take you elsewhere." "But you could ask her," Clara pressed. "She listens to you different than she listens to other people." "Different how?" Elliot asked, curious despite himself. Clara's brow furrowed in concentration. "Like how the mare listens when you talk to her in the barn. All quiet and paying attention, even to the spaces between words." The observation, astute beyond Clara's years, stirred something warm in Elliot's chest. "I'll think on it," he promised, which both of them knew meant he would. That afternoon, while Isabel rested on the porch and Clara explored the puddles left by the storm, Elliot retreated to his small workshop in the barn. The space was well organized, tools hanging from pegs on the wall, a workbench positioned to catch the light from the single window. Shavings and sawdust covered the floor, evidence of recent activity after years of disuse. From a drawer beneath the workbench, Elliot withdrew a small piece of pine, pale and fine-grained. He had been working on it in stolen moments over the past week, when Clara was occupied elsewhere and wouldn't discover his project prematurely. Now he set to work with renewed purpose, his knife moving with practiced precision, shaping the wood, according to a vision only he could see. Hours. Past, marked only by the changing angle of sunlight through the window and the gradual emergence of form from formlessness beneath his hands. When at last he set down his knife and held the carving up to the light, satisfaction warmed his gaze. It was a wild rose, similar to the pendant he had carved for Sarah years ago, yet distinctly different. This one a bud just beginning to open, full of promise and potential rather than in full bloom. He had chosen to leave it attached to a small branch, complete with delicate leaves, creating a piece that could stand on its own rather than be worn. As he carefully wrapped the carving in a clean handkerchief, Elliot acknowledged to himself what the gift represented, not merely a fulfillment of Clara's request, but a declaration of intent. A step toward a future he had not dared to imagine until a child's cry had broken the silence of his exile. That evening, after supper had been cleared away, Elliot cleared his throat, drawing the attention of both Isabel and Clara. "Made something today," he said, reaching into his pocket for the wrapped carving. For Clara. Clara's eyes widened as he placed the small bundle on the table before her. With reverent care, she unwrapped the handkerchief, gasping softly as the wooden rose was revealed. "It's beautiful," she breathed, carefully lifting the carving to examine it from all angles, like a real one that's about to bloom. "Some things need time," Elliot said, his eyes moving to Isabel, who watched them with an expression that mingled joy and uncertainty, to reach their full potential. "Can I show Mama?" Clara asked, already carrying the carving to where Isabel sat. Isabel took the offered gift, her fingers tracing the delicate petals, the carefully rendered leaves. "It's exquisite, Elliot," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "A true gift." "First of many," he replied, the words emerging before he could reconsider them. "If you'd allow it." Isabel's eyes met his, understanding dawning in their depths. "Elliot, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "Just think on it, both of you, whether you might consider making your stay here less temporary." Clara looked between them, hope illuminating her features. "You mean we could live here, for always?" "If your mother agrees," Elliot hedged, unwilling to promise what he couldn't guarantee. "This place, it's been silent too long. Could use some life in it again." Isabel set the carving, carefully on the table, her expression thoughtful. "It's not a small thing you're suggesting, Elliot, for any of us." "No," he agreed, "but maybe that's fitting. Small things blow away too easy in this country." Clara picked up the wooden rose again, cradling it in her palms as if it were alive and fragile. "I'll put it by my bed," she declared, "so it's the first thing I see every morning." As she carried her treasure to her sleeping place, Isabel rose and moved to stand beside Elliot, close, enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You're sure?" she asked quietly. "This isn't gratitude or obligation speaking." Elliot turned to face her fully, allowing her to see the truth in his eyes. 7 years I've been living half a life, Isabel. Then you and Clara appear, and suddenly I'm remembering what it is to be whole." He paused, searching for words that had grown rusty with disuse. "I can't promise I won't carry ghosts. Can't promise I'll always find the right words. But I can. Promise to try, every day, if you'll both stay." Isabel's hand rose slowly, coming to rest against his cheek, her touch gentle but firm. "We carry our own ghosts, Elliot. The question is whether we let them rule us or learn to live alongside them." "And your answer?" he asked, hardly daring to breathe. A smile curved her lips, warming her eyes. "I think," she said softly, "that Clara and I might be persuaded to put down roots in the right soil." From across the room, Clara watched them. The wooden rose clutched to her chest, her face alight with the pure joy of a child who sees her dearest wish taking shape before her eyes. Dawn arrived with gentle insistence, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Elliot stood on the porch, coffee mug warming his hands, watching as the sun's first rays touched the hills surrounding the valley. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of warmth to come, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark welcomed the new day with its liquid song. The past week had unfolded in a rhythm both novel and familiar, the three of them finding their way together, establishing patterns that accommodated each person's needs and strengths. Isabel had taken over much of the cooking, her skills improving with practice and Elliot's patient guidance. Clara had assumed responsibility for the chickens, developing a rapport even with the troublesome brown hen that had previously terrorized all who approached its nest. Elliot found himself speaking, more than he had in years, words coming easier with each passing day. The silence that had been his refuge now felt empty, compared to the rich tapestry of conversation, laughter, and even occasional disagreement that filled the cabin. Yet, beneath the surface of their developing domesticity ran currents of uncertainty. No formal decisions had been made, no clear declarations offered beyond the initial suggestion that Isabel and Clara might stay. The future remained unwritten, a blank page that both beckoned and intimidated. The sound of the cabin door opening behind him drew Elliot from his thoughts. Isabel stepped onto the porch, her own mug in hand, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had rarely seen it. "You're up early," she observed, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "Old habits," he replied with a slight shrug. "Used to like watching the world wake up with Anna. After, it became a time for remembering." Isabel studied his profile in the growing light. "And now?" Elliot considered the question, searching for honesty rather than what might please her. "Now it feels like looking forward instead of back. Strange, but not unwelcome." A smile touched Isabel's lips. Change often is. She took a sip of her coffee, then added, "Clara's decided the mare's foal should be named Rosebud, after her calving. She's already planning how she'll help train it once it's born." "Making plans for a future here," Elliot noted. "Is that something you've considered too?" The directness of the question hung between them, demanding equal candor in response. Isabel set her mug on the railing, turning to face him fully. "I've considered many things these past weeks, Elliot. What it would mean to stop running. What it would mean for Clara to have stability, a place to call home." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "What it would mean to build something new with someone who understands loss, but refuses to be defined by it." "And your conclusions?" "That, I'm afraid," she admitted simply. "Not of you or of what we might become together, but of hoping too much, of believing that happiness might be sustainable rather than fleeting." Elliot nodded, understanding the fear intimately. "When Anna and Sarah died, I thought I'd never feel anything but grief again. Then I grew numb, which seemed preferable." His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, seeking the wooden pendant that was no longer there, but now sat on the mantel. Inside. "When you and Clara arrived, feeling returned, and yes, it was frightening. Still is sometimes." "Then why risk it?" Isabel asked, the question genuine rather than challenging. "Why open yourself to possible pain again?" Elliot considered the sunrise spreading across the valley, the way light transformed the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful each morning. "Because the alternative is half living," he said finally, "and 7 years of that was enough." He turned to her. Then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I can't promise nothing will ever hurt you or Clara. Can't promise I'll always be the man you need. But I can promise to try, every day, to be worthy of the trust you'd be placing in me." Isabel's eyes softened, something resolute settling in her expression. "I've learned that promises aren't guarantees, Elliot. They're intentions, declarations of what we hope to be true." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her green eyes. "And intentions matter. They're the seeds from which better futures grow." The metaphor stirred something in Elliot, a memory of fields planted in hope, of watching green shoots push through dark soil toward sunlight, of belief in harvest despite the uncertainty of weather, pests, and fate. "Then let me declare my intention," he said, his voice low but steady. "I want you and Clara to stay, not as guests, but as family. I want to build something lasting with you both, day by day, season by season." Isabel's hand rose to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "And I intend to accept," she replied softly, "to put down roots here, with you, to see what might grow from this unexpected beginning." The moment hung suspended between them, fragile and profound. Then, with the natural gravity of two bodies meant to align, they drew together. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the meeting of two people who had forgotten the language of intimacy and were learning it anew. Then it deepened, becoming a promise more binding than words could express. When they parted, Isabel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, not of sorrow, but of release, the letting go of a burden carried too long alone. Elliot's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that escaped to trace a silvery path down her skin. "I never thought," he began, then stopped, overcome. "I know," she whispered, understanding all he couldn't say. "Neither did I." The sound of the cabin door opening again announced Clara's arrival, sleep-tousled and curious. "Are you watching the sunrise?" she asked, coming to stand between them at the railing. "Pa used to say that each new morning is the world being born again." Elliot and Isabel exchanged a glance over her head, a world of meaning in the simple look. "Your pa was a wise man," Elliot said, resting a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "And I think today's sunrise is especially worth watching." Clara leaned against him, comfortable and trusting as the three of them stood together, bearing witness to the dawn of something far more significant than merely another day. Autumn came to Dust Valley in a riot of color and cooling breezes, transforming the landscape with its golden touch. The cottonwoods along the creek blazed yellow against the deepening blue of the sky, and mornings arrived with a crisp clarity that spoke of winter's approach. 3 months had passed since the morning on the porch, when intentions had been declared and a new path chosen. 3 months of adjustment, of learning the rhythms of shared life, of discovering how 3 separate stories could weave together into one continuing narrative. The cabin had changed, expanding to accommodate its growing family. Elliot and the local carpenter had added a small bedroom for Clara, complete with a window that looked out over the corral where the mare's foal, now 2 months old, frolicked on spindly legs. Rosebud, as Clara had insisted on naming him, had indeed proven to be as delicate as his namesake in appearance, though his spirit was pure, untamed energy. The wooden chest that had once gathered dust in the corner now stood open, its contents displayed on shelves built specifically to showcase Elliot's carvings. New pieces had joined the old, a small figure of Clara feeding chickens, another of Isabel at the garden gate, a family of 3 standing together before a cabin. The past and present coexisted in that collection, honoring what had been lost while celebrating what had been found. On this particular autumn afternoon, Elliot stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching as Clara led Rosebud around the corral on a long lead. Her small face was set in concentration, her movements confident but gentle, guiding rather than forcing the young horse to follow her direction. Isabel approached from the garden, a basket of late vegetables on her arm. Her cheeks, flushed from work and the cool air. She paused beside Elliot, following his gaze to their daughter, for so Clara had become to them both, through love, if not law. "She has your patience," Isabel observed, leaning slightly against Elliot's side, "and your way with animals." "Has your determination," Elliot countered with a smile. "Wouldn't give up until that foal trusted her completely." Isabel's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of those who have chosen each other deliberately. "She's flourishing here," she said softly. "We both are." Elliot squeezed her hand gently. "As am I." The admission came easily now, where once it would have been impossible to voice. The past months had taught him that joy was not a betrayal of those lost, that opening his heart to Isabel and Clara didn't diminish what he had felt for Anna and Sarah. Love, he had discovered, was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but a living thing that grew stronger with use. "I finished it," he said, nodding toward the workshop behind him. "Want to see?" Curiosity brightened Isabel's eyes. The secret project? Finally! For weeks, Elliot had been working on something in his spare moments, refusing to reveal its nature even to Isabel. Now he led her into the workshop, where a cloth-covered object stood on his workbench. With a mixture of pride and nervousness, he removed the cloth, revealing a carved sign. The wood was polished to a warm glow, the letters deep and sure, framed by intricately carved wild roses that twined around the edges. "Kane Family Ranch," it read simply. Isabel's breath caught. Her fingers traced the letters, then the delicate flowers that surrounded them. "It's beautiful, Elliot. Thought we'd hang it at the entrance to the property," he explained. "Make it official." The meaning behind the gesture was clear to both of them. Though they had not yet formalized their relationship in the eyes of the law or church, that would come with a trip to Cottonwood Springs before winter set in. This was Elliot's declaration to the world that they were a family, bound by choice rather than merely circumstance. "Clara will be overjoyed," Isabel said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's been practicing writing Clara Kane in her lesson book when she thinks I'm not looking." Elliot's expression softened at this revelation. "Smart girl. Too smart for her own good sometimes," Isabel agreed with a laugh. "Yesterday, she informed me that, since we're going to be a proper family, we should consider giving her a brother or sister to round things out." Elliot's eyebrows rose, a flush coloring his cheeks. "Did she now?" "Indeed. Apparently, Rosebud needs a companion as much as she does." Isabel's eyes held a mixture of amusement and something deeper, more meaningful. "I told her some things take time, but not too much time," Elliot replied softly, his hand coming to rest at the small of Isabel's back, drawing her closer. "No," she agreed, her smile intimate. "Not too much." A call from outside interrupted the moment. "Mama, Mr. Kane, come see. Rosebud did the turn all by himself." They emerged from the workshop to find Clara beaming with pride as the foal trotted obediently at her side, responding to subtle signals with the trust that comes from patient handling. "Well done, both of you," Elliot praised, crossing to the corral fence. "He's going to be a fine horse with your teaching." Clara's face glowed with the compliment. "Can we show Mrs. Henderson when she comes for my reading lesson tomorrow? She said she'd never seen a foal trained so young." "I think that can be arranged," Isabel replied, joining them at the fence. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who lived on the neighboring ranch, had begun coming twice weekly to continue Clara's education, bringing books and assignments, staying for tea and conversation that had evolved into genuine friendship. It was one of many connections that had formed or strengthened over the past months, as Elliot's self-imposed isolation gradually yielded to the reality of family life. The storekeeper in the small settlement at the valley's edge now greeted them by name. The blacksmith saved interesting bits of metal for Clara's collection. The circuit-riding preacher stopped for dinner when his route brought him near. Slowly, steadily, the web of community that Elliot had once severed was being rewoven thread by thread. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the valley, the three of them walked together toward the cabin. The evening routine awaited: chores to complete, supper to prepare, stories to share around the table, ordinary moments that, strung together, created a life of extraordinary richness. At the cabin door, Elliot paused, looking back at the land that had once been his refuge and was now his home in the truest sense. Dust Valley lay golden in the late light, the very soil that had witnessed his grief now bearing witness to his renewal. Clara slipped her hand into his, tugging him inside. "Come on, Mr. Kane. I mean Pa," she corrected herself, the new title still fresh and precious on her tongue. "I want to show you what I drew in my lesson book today." Isabel met his eyes over Clara's head, her gaze full of understanding for the journey they had taken, separately and together, to arrive at this moment. Elliot squeezed Clara's hand gently, allowing himself to be led across the threshold, into the warmth and light that waited within. "I'm coming," he said softly. "I'm right here." And he was, fully present, fully alive, in a way he had thought lost forever. In the unexpected arrival of a desperate child and her wounded mother, he had found not merely companionship but redemption, not just a second chance at family, but a first chance at forgiveness, of himself, of fate, of the cruel randomness that life sometimes imposed. As the door closed behind them, the last rays of sunlight caught the wooden rose that stood on the mantel beside the carved horse, symbols of what had been lost and what had been found, sharing space in a home where the past was honored but no longer haunted, where the future stretched before them, uncertain but faced together. In Dust Valley, where once a solitary man had sought to disappear, a family had emerged instead, proof that even in the most barren places, given time and tenderness, life finds a way to bloom anew.